Welcome to Reconquest on the Crusade Premium Channel, part of the Veritas Radio Network. This is Brother André-Marie coming to you from St. Benedict Center in Richmond, New Hampshire. Our websites are Catholicism.org and Reconquest.net. My email address, should you like to shoot me a very brief email with a comment, question, or suggestion, is bam@Catholicism.org. That's bam@Catholicism.org. You can also find me on social media. Just search for Brother André-Marie, and you should find me there if I'm there. This evening's episode is episode number 336, and I'm calling it From Hyperpapalism to Catholicism, and that's because I'm basically stealing the name of the book of my guest, who is Dr. Peter A. Kwasniewski, who should not need an introduction to my audience, and since we have an awful lot to discuss, I won't read any of his bio. You can find this out in any number of websites that the good doctor writes for. Good evening, Dr. Kwasniewski.
Yes, good evening, brother.
So you've come out with a new couple of books. It's a 2-volume set called The Road from Hyperpapalism to Catholicism. And full disclosure, I have only read volume 1, and which we agreed ahead of time would be really the subject of our discussion this evening, because it gives the principles, the theological principles. And the second volume goes into, some of the high points or low points, as it were, of the present pontificate, and it gives you sort of concrete ways to apply the principles that you enunciate in volume 1. So, why don't we begin with just sort of defining our terms a bit? What exactly do you mean by hyperpapalism?
Yes, it's in a way it's a slightly redundant term, because I think one could also just as well say papalism, with the ism suggesting almost an elevation of a particular principle into a universal principle, the way that we derive Catholicism from Catholic. So you could say any time that the Pope is seen as the definition or the sum total or the linchpin or what have you of the entire Catholic faith, it's a kind of papalism, right? Mm-hmm. But hyperpapalism suggests an exaggerated, excessive veneration of the person of the Pope, or an excessive adherence to everything he says, all the dicta et acta of the Pope, whatever they may be, good, bad, indifferent. And so it's an excess, right? If we think about it in terms of Aristotelian virtue theory, right? There's the golden mean, and then you have excess and defect. Mm-hmm. The defect would be rejecting the papacy altogether, either in principle as the Protestants do, or de facto as the Orthodox do. But the excess would be, misinterpreting the role of the Pope and exaggerating it.
So if virtus stat in medio, if virtue stands in the middle, then the true Orthodox Catholic position is going to be avoiding the sort of the Scylla and Charybdis of the Lutheran rejection of the papacy on the one side, and the sort of, to use one of your words, hypertrophic, sort of bloated notion of the papacy on the other hand. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But by the way, you use the word hypertrophism a couple times in the book, and you also introduced me to the word vociferous, so I thank you for giving me an expanded vocabulary.
The word vociferous is just one of those words that, at least once you know it, it's almost impossible not to want to use it.
Yeah. Well, I'm that way. I'll have to find some way to sneak it into something I wrote, just so that I sound erudite. But it's also a useful word because it's this multiplication by division. You're talking about Protestantism and how it just sort of breaks up and breaks up and breaks up. So we're avoiding these two extremes, and we're shooting for the virtue which is in the middle. Now, again, in the area of defining terms, the term ultramontanism is used a lot in Catholic circles, and it means, over the mountains, the Northern Europeans who look to papal authority against sort of the spirit of Gallicanism or the spirit of any of the kind of Gallican-like errors that had floated around Europe, and they looked to the authority of the Pope as the head of the church. So there's that ultramontanism that would, you'd categorize, say, Cardinal P or Dom Guéranger or people like that as ultramontanists. But then there was kind of an exaggerated ultramontanism. So are you against the use of the word ultramontanism, or do you think that it's just this exaggerated ultramontanism that's the problem?
Yes, I've had a bit of an evolution in my use of that word. Years ago, I used to think that ultramontanism simply meant an exaggerated adherence to the person or acts or deeds of the Pope. But I was sort of put in my place by a friend, Roberto de Mattei, as well as by Jose Ureta, whom I don't know personally, but just by correspondence, who both explained very, very patiently, and I think very charitably in a number of articles that they've published, that ultramontanism is a historical phenomenon. It describes a certain loosely defined group of associates and allies in the 19th century who were all, as you said, looking to the Pope for guidance in a period of revolution, in a period of false proposals for reform, a period of anti-clericalism and Freemasonry and so on. And really, ultramontanism is, in a sense, a neutral historical descriptive term, and those people were actually promoting something good at the time, something good and necessary, and that should be sharply distinguished from the hypertrophic, the exaggerated papalism that we're talking about.
Okay.
Let me just say there were within the ultramontanist spectrum. It was a spectrum. And there were people who were extreme ultramontanists.
Okay, can we pivot on that and go a little deeper into that question? Because the next thing I was going to ask you is about Newman and the inopportunists at Vatican I. But these things coalesce because there was, around the time of Vatican I, and I'm going to say especially in France, at the risk of offending some people perhaps, there were people who, and I think it's because they didn't have the scholastic foundation that, say, Spaniards and others had, when they were considering these theological questions. They, for instance, the false traditionalism, the idea that all knowledge comes through language and we can't trust our senses. So Vatican I actually had to talk about the reliability of the senses and the fact that reason is important as well as faith. So there were these false notions that were wrapped up with some of the, I should say, into some of the same persons who were defending papal infallibility, right? I mean, so you had, I forget, it was Louis de Villot, or some of these guys had some weird philosophical errors wrapped up, right?
Yes, and in fact, one article that I would definitely recommend to listeners is the one that I published at 1 Peter 5 about a week ago, called "The Spirit of Vatican I as a Post-Revolutionary Problem," and there I talk about Louis Veuillot a little bit. I talk about Joseph de Maistre and the theories of absolute political power that were being taken from a secular domain and applied in a sacred domain, or in the hierarchy of the church to the papacy. And these views of absolute authority were proposed as a way to crush liberalism once and for all, right? What you need is a kind of almighty pope who will just step on, the European liberals, and crush them, right? And so what they don't seem to have entertained the possibility of, or maybe they did and they just thought they thought this could never happen, God would never allow this to happen, is a pope who himself was a liberal, right? They never, that didn't occur to them, that what happens if you give sort of the nuclear arsenal to a certain office because the person in it is, let's say the person in it is Trump, and then you get Biden, right? And they both have the nuclear arsenal, right? This is a bad situation. That's maybe a silly example, but you understand the point.
Yeah, it's a great point. I mean, and that that absolutizing of power, which was a reaction against the revolution, they should have known that in the persons of these enlightened monarchs in Europe, quote unquote, that some of the ones who led to the revolution, were these royals and aristocrats who were sort of hanging out in the same parlors as Voltaire and Diderot and these guys.
Yes. Now, this is a very important point. If you look at the history of the papacy, one of the most striking features of it is the dogged conservatism, the dogged traditionalism in the usual sense of the word of the incumbents of the papacy. They are not interested in innovation or novelty. They are not interested in aggiornamento, in bringing the church up to date to the contemporary world of their time. They are interested in holding fast to the faith that was handed down and using their authority to defend it, to explicate it, to refute or condemn heresies against it. But basically, you could forgive some of the ultramontanists for thinking that they would always have a pope who was a stalwart defender of the Catholic faith, and who was, in a sense, anointed from above with an with infallibility, not only as regards solemn teaching, but even just as regards ordinary teaching and disciplinary and governance actions. So this is the kind of view that we're dealing with, and it does seem to me as if the minority at the First Vatican Council, Newman, of course, wasn't there because he had no business being there, but he was following it very closely. The minority, some of whom were Gallicans, Newman himself wasn't a Gallican, they were objecting on the basis of the record of church history shows a much more symbiotic and holistic relationship of the Pope and the episcopacy around the world, and you might say the corporate responsibility for Catholic tradition, that all the bishops as successors of the apostles received the tradition. All of them are called upon to defend it. They're not vicars of the Pope. They don't receive their office and authority from the Pope. They receive it directly from Christ, even if he appoints them, the Pope appoints them. So I think this is what the minority was trying to bring out and to defend and to uphold.
Okay, now along those same lines, much later in the book, of course, I haven't actually opened the book yet as far as asking you specific questions in the book, but on page 129, there's a section called "The Shepherds We Have and the Shepherds We Need," and you quote a lady named Browden McHugh, who talks about in an article called "Bishops Unbound." Actually, I don't know if you're quoting her. No, you're paraphrasing her, but she points out that in the last 2 centuries, we've seen a centralization of ecclesiastical power in the hands of bishops and the Pope, like nothing ever before seen in the history of the Catholic Church. Prior to this turn towards unification, concentration, and exclusivity, the Church was far more diversified in its power base. The laity, primarily in its princes, aristocrats, and guilds, the clergy and their cathedral chapters and associations co-determined the manner in which the Church was governed. Okay, and it goes on. As I was reading this, I made sort of a marginal note that relative to, and again, we're making an analogy with the political realm, specifically in the realm of European monarchies. And in the European monarchies, you had this immediate pre-revolutionary idea of monarchical absolutism, which was really not traditional. It was something that was kind of an abuse, and it stepped in the traditional rights of the aristocracy and of the guilds and of similar sort of intermediate type organizations that stood between the state and the family. But then you have, I have this sort of loyalty, I'm part Spanish, towards Carlism, towards Spanish Carlism, and the idea that the Carlists, I think, who were very philosophically based, had this much more diffused concept of authority and they respected first the rights of God, then the traditional rights of the local rights, local rule. They call it fueros in Spanish. And they also had the place for the king, but he was the last of the four Carlist pillars, Dios, Patria, Fueros, y Rey. It seems to more closely resemble the medieval notion where, there is what we might call checks and balances, but the checks and balances aren't, the three branches like we have in the Constitution of the United States, but they were really tradition, the moral law, the faith itself, and also these different local customs in these different places, so that you didn't just hyper-amalgamate everything into this big national glob.
Exactly.
Now, do you find that to be kind of a fit analogy with the way power was more traditionally diffused in the church?
Exactly. No, that's a perfect analogy. Obviously, we know that it's part of the Catholic faith that the Pope and the bishops have a special place in the church. They are the hierarchical authorities in the church who rule and teach and sanctify in the name of Jesus Christ and by his power. So there's no question here of a kind of democratic church, or the way that some people are speaking of synodality nowadays as like a little bit of this group and a little bit of that group, and they all put their ideas together and act on them.
It's very bureaucratic.
There's nothing that, but what the tradition shows us, what history shows us, is a different kind of diversification and responsibility, where every member of the mystical body, but especially I would say the more prominent members among the laity, and then certainly the lower clergy as well as the higher clergy, but everyone in the church felt himself to be responsible for the church and for the Catholic faith, that everyone had received it in baptism, had been strengthened in it by confirmation, was in fact the sensus fidei, right, is relevant in this regard, that every baptized member of the church, if he is properly catechized, if he's living a sacramental life, that he has a certain sense of what is in accord with the faith, what is in harmony with the faith. The way that St. Thomas speaks about the virtuous man has an instinct for what is in accord with virtue and is repulsed by what is vicious. He talks about that especially in connection with the virtue of temperance, right? It's not, so there would be a sense then in which if a medieval king saw, or an emperor saw, that a pope or a bishop was acting out of line, either in terms of prudential governance or in terms of teaching, then they would just simply say they would object, and they would oppose it in whatever way they could, and sometimes even threaten, because again of this sense of co-responsibility.
Mm-hmm. And that's not a kind of an anti-clericalism. It's a I guess it's the Ecclesia Decens exercising its responsibility to protect the deposit of faith, even if the Ecclesia Docens is getting out of hand. Right. I mean, you could think of it this way, that in a healthy functioning body, well, I don't know if there's really a medical metaphor here that I could use, but what I'm thinking of is in normal healthy functioning circumstances, certain members of the church can simply accept what they're being given and get on with their lives. But in an emergency situation, when there's sort of an autoimmune condition and the body is attacking itself, that's when the soul, the principle of life in the church, the Holy Spirit, stirs up many organs and cells in the body to defend and to try to repair and to repulse whatever the harm is that's taking place. So there's no question here that in a healthy situation, Catholics should simply be able to listen to the Pope and the bishops and their local pastors with humble acceptance and gratitude and obedience. So to question the wrong kind of leadership in the church is not to be anti-leadership, to be antinomian or anti-obedience or something like that. That's what our opponents always try to throw at us. Yeah, and I thought you addressed that more than adequately in the book in a couple of spots. You coined, I think, you're listening to Reconquest on the Crusade Premium Channel, part of the Touch Radio Network. This is Brother André-Marie, and I'm interviewing Dr. Peter Kwasniewski on his book, his new 2-volume book called The Road from Hyperpapalism to Catholicism, published by Aruka Press. And I'll have a link to it from the reconquest.net page where you can get that book at Aruka Press. Okay, so you coined the phrase. I think you coined it. It's been used, and I think it's been, I think I got the impression from your book that somebody had taken umbrage with it. When I first saw it in print, I kind of winced, and then I thought about it and said, okay, this can obviously be understood in a correct way. The false spirit of Vatican I. You speak of the false spirit of Vatican. Am I right? You got some blowback on that?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Because in the book you have a footnote where you talked about the exaggerated reception of papal infallibility after the First Vatican Council, and you said this is obviously what I meant when I wrote the false spirit of Vatican I.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, on that point, it's just simply a fact that there was a minimalist and a maximalist interpretation of the decree Pastor Aeternus, especially what it says about the Pope's infallibility and about his supreme and universal jurisdiction. And the Newman himself, I think, makes a very good case that it's proper, it's humbler, it's more in keeping with the spirit of the church to interpret things in a minimalist way. That is, as not demanding more than the face value of what's there in its context with everything else. So, as you probably know, Bismarck was very upset with Pastor Aeternus, Bismarck of Germany, the chancellor, and a clarification was issued that by the German bishops that Pope Pius IX approved. And when you read that, it's a minimalist interpretation, interpretation of Pastor Aeternus. It says the least that needs to be said on the basis of Pastor Aeternus, rather than, in a sense, blowing it up and making it something that it doesn't have to be, right?
Now, my mentor, Brother Francis, used to. He taught me that Vatican I was a gift to the Church in more than one way. Not only did it teach papal infallibility, but it also limited it, because there were these exaggerated notions among many of the, say, less philosophically based ultramontanists, and those errors got kind of corrected, at least implicitly corrected.
Yes.
Yes.
Sorry.
No, but my question is: did Vatican II sufficiently explain the limits, or did it not go far enough? And I have a follow-up.
Yeah, well, I did want to say one last point about Vatican I. There was a German Bishop Hefele there. He was a church historian, and he
wrote the history of the councils, the multi-volume history of the councils.
That's right, and he was one of the last holdouts on the definition. It displeased him very much as a church historian. He did accept it in the end, but he accepted it on the basis of a minimalist interpretation, and the Pope accepted that. The Pope said, yes, you can do it this way. In my article at 1 Peter 5, I go into more detail about what the difference between the minimalist and the maximalist interpretations would look like, or do look like. But about Vatican II,
well, I may have said Vatican II and I meant to say Vatican I. My question was, did Vatican I go far enough in limiting papal infallibility?
Yes. Here's what I think, is that the definition of infallibility, which, as you know, I talk about, I quote it, and I quote especially Adrian Fortescue's commentary on it, which I think is really, really excellent.
Yes, I have that highlighted.
It's very, very precise, crystal clear analysis of what it says and what it doesn't say. It really is. What it's doing is it's exalting the Pope's God-given role to teach the entire church bindingly on a matter of faith and morals. if he judges it to be necessary, without the consent of the rest of the church, without the bishop saying, yes, go ahead, we give you the green light. But he has to be defining something ex cathedra in a solemn way, indicate that he's doing so. And as has been pointed out, this is typically accompanied by some kind of anathema against those who don't hold what is being defined. And so in the end, when it comes to dogmatic infallibility as proper to the Pope, it's a quite narrow situation that's being described. It's not papal encyclicals, apostolic letters, post-synodal apostolic exhortations, general audiences, airplane interviews, etc. Right? None of that stuff is what's being talked about. Where I think it's a little more troublesome, and where, frankly, a lot of the tension comes in the church today between traditionalists and, let's say, Pope Francis, but not only Pope Francis, of course, is in the area of jurisdiction, in what the Pope is allowed to decree, what he can command and forbid, right? That is to say, in the realm of prudential and disciplinary decisions. That's really where I think a lot of the anguish and the arguments take place. Vatican I's formulation of that is quite open-ended. It doesn't, at least in Pastor Aeternus, it doesn't really limit the Pope's power in the prudential or practical domain to legislate. However, and this is a very important point, Pastor Aeternus is not the only document of Vatican I. There's also Dei Filius, which you alluded to earlier. And in Dei Filius, we learn that each Christian is equipped by God with two powers, the power of reason and the supernatural power of faith. And so the individual Christian, not that he is certainly he can't be the sole judge, but he is, by his own reason, a judge of when there's a flagrant contradiction, like the contradiction between Familiaris Consortio and Amoris Laetitia, or between Veritatis Splendor and everything that Pope Francis has done in the moral.
Okay.
And reason tells us that there is this contradiction, and Vatican I is a great defender of that natural power of reason. And similarly, as this is a little bit the point I was making earlier about the sensus fidei, Vatican I is very keen to say that faith is a real gift infused in us, given to us, by which we can adhere to and discern divinely revealed mysteries, divinely revealed truths. And so, again, we're not simply beholden to the Pope for these things, as if we're sort of like mindless automata, and we have to just say, fill me up, your Holy Father, because I have no faculties of my own by which to know the Catholic faith, right? And then within this area of jurisdiction, if a pope were to, let's say, attack the common good of the church in the form of its traditional liturgy, which both Newman and Ratzinger say would be contrary to the spirit of the church to attack the traditional liturgy, then a lowly layman, who is no part of the hierarchy, can still say both non possumus, we can't go along with this, and non licet, it's not even lawful.
Yeah. So there's as I'm listening to you, it came to mind that, and I'm no canonist, but if I understand correctly, in the Code of Canon Law, the current Code of Canon Law, Canon 87, has a little appendage of this kind of subsidiarity where the bishop can sort of override certain papal decrees and say, well, this isn't going to apply in my diocese because of this situation. And that's what some of the bishops are doing with Traditionis Custodes.
Yes, exactly. Canon 87 is an amazing canon because it says the bishop can, I don't have my Code of Canon Law right next to me, so I don't remember the exact phrasing of it, but basically the bishop can choose to suspend or not to apply a law in his diocese, even if it comes from the supreme authority. That's what it says.
Yeah.
Clearly talking about the Pope, right? So Archbishop Sample and the Bishop of Lake Charles, John Provost.
My home state.
And Bishop Olmsted I believe, are three, and they're not the only ones who have invoked Canon 87. Bishop Paprocki, I believe, maybe I was thinking of Paprocki instead of Olmsted. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and I think that Sample is a canonist himself, and I think he was the first, if I'm not mistaken. But now, okay, so we're talking about. So here I have a follow-up that I told you about that about a future ecumenical council. Now, sort of. Now, Venerable Bartholomew Holzhauser, whom you quote on something else in the book. One of the things he prophesied in an approved private revelations talked about a future ecumenical council that will, if I'm remembering his exact words correctly, make clear the proper interpretation of Scripture. And I know the Kolbe Center people make a big deal about properly so, of Venerable Bartholomew Holzhauser. And this future council, which interestingly, there's a Russian mystic who also prophesied a future council. And I kind of have my ideas about how it's the same council and it'll be a reunion council, like picking up where Leon and Florence failed. Leon too and Florence failed. But so okay, here's a scenario. It's the year 2045, and an aging and venerable Dr. Peter Kwasniewski is asked to be a peritus at the second council, the Second Council of Trent. Okay, things are bad in Rome, so they, the pig problem is continuing in Rome. They have all these swine overrunning Rome, like it's literally happening now. I understand. And so they have to go up north to Trento. Now, what would your chief proposals be for completing the work of Vatican I on papal infallibility, to clarify it, in light of the debacle that happened after Vatican II and also the false interpretation of Vatican I? What would your proposals be, Peritus Peter?
That's a marvelous question. I feel like it's a question that I would, in a way, I should sit with for a few hours before trying to answer. But one thing I would certainly say is that there needs to be much greater clarity about the Pope's boundedness to tradition, and not just tradition with a capital T, which is rather difficult to pin down what exactly that contains. But tradition in all of its dimensions, including ecclesiastical traditions with an S on the end. And so it seems to me that implicitly throughout the whole history of the Church, the popes have seen themselves as guardians, truly as custodes traditionis. They have really seen themselves that way. But that was more or less chucked out the window especially by Paul VI, to a lesser extent by John the 23rd and Pius XII. But really all of the modern popes seem to have imbibed this spirit of the maximalist view of Vatican I, that nothing can stop them from reconfiguring Catholic life according to their own lights about what the modern age needs. And nothing can stop them from doing that, because they will be protected by God from ever making a catastrophic mistake. I can't take seriously the idea that we have not seen catastrophic mistakes. I mean, I know there are still, websites like Where Peter Is, or they've never seen a papal decision or decree that they don't love.
Yes,
yes. But I mean, for me, it's and for many of us who've studied these things, it's the 20th and 21st centuries are one catastrophe after the next, in a certain sense. It's a kind of like a papacy drunkenly stumbling from one scandalous thing to another. And I mean, obviously, I'm not saying that that's all that there is. There are plenty of good things mixed in there as well. So I think there needs to be a great clarification about the Pope's boundedness to tradition. And the best way to enforce that would be to reintroduce the papal oath, the coronation oath, in the form in which it's found in the first millennium. In the, what is it, the Liber, you'll be able to help me out with this, the Liber Pontificalis.
The Pontificali Romanum?
No. I'm talking about it. It's like a book of chronicles from the first millennium that has the papal oath written into it.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I can't help you there, but I know I've seen it written, but I don't have it in my memory.
That would be, I mean, if you read the text of that oath, which is contained in, I have lecture called The Pope's Boundedness to Tradition, which is in the book From Benedict's Peace to Francis's War. It's also on Rorate Caeli. But I quote a nice, freshly made English translation of that papal oath, and it's really remarkable because it hits every topic that needs to be hit. The Pope swears to guard the sacramental rights of the Church as they've been handed to him, and so on and so forth. And of course, referring to the traditional sacramental rights, not to the Novus Ordo. Mm-hmm. So that would be one thing. Another thing would be to clarify very carefully what Vatican II meant when it said that bishops are not merely vicars of the Pope. So I think that there would be something like, maybe this would require a revision of canon law, that no bishop could be deposed without due process and without some kind of there has to be some kind of process to prevent what happened to Bishop Torres
in Puerto Rico, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Do you have any suggestions for me?
What the Peritas could do? Well, I don't.
Yes.
I was going to say something about the papal oath because to me that oath itself shows you the limited character of the papacy, that he is in a sense the most bound man on earth because he has to receive something from his predecessors. There's an exact mention of what he has received from his predecessors, which of course is the very notion, the very concept of tradition.
Exactly. There's this phenomenon we're seeing a lot with Pope Francis. I mean, it existed already prior to him, but he's really he's taken it in a sort of warp speed direction. But what I call the magisterium of me. Or the magisterium of the moment.
Yes.
And probably the most outrageous example of that is the death penalty change to the Catechism, where there's a new text given with the fishy, the highly suspicious word inadmissible, which has never been used in any context before, so nobody knows exactly what it means. I argue in Volume 2 there that it certainly means immoral. That's the only way that it can be taken in context. But he has a single footnote, and it's to a speech by himself. that he gave, not too long before, in which he says that the death penalty is per se contrary to the gospel and to human dignity. This is the what I like to call the unholy trinity of me, myself, and I. What's your basis for this? Well, actually, you can't really point to any source in the tradition that says the death penalty is inherently wrong. Certainly not any authority that would have a binding nature on us. But you can certainly point to gobs and gobs of sources that do, in fact, say that the state has the right to inflict the death penalty in certain circumstances.
And in the book you quote, I think it's a Benedictine friend, and right after you quoted the Dominican friend saying essentially the same thing. But the issue is not the issue, I think, was, in other words, that he was talking about this particular thing, and he says essentially it's not just that he wanted to change this teaching. He inserted into the Catechism this just like dogma by fiat, doctrine by fiat. Sort of like modern money. I just made dogma. Look, I have because I have the Vatican press at my service.
Right, and in fact, this is all extremely dangerous because, as even the conservative Catholics are seeing more and more, not even us extremists and restorationists, but even the conservative Catholics are watching with dismay as the so-called Pontifical Academy for Life, which was gutted by Francis and reconfigured, is turning into a think tank for questioning and trying to overthrow Humanae Vitae, Donum Vitae, all of these watershed moments when the Pope or the CDF actually upheld perennial Catholic moral teaching on human sexuality. So this idea of a kind of what we've talked about, I think, before, Darwinian or Hegelian development of doctrine, evolution of doctrine, where you can sort of pull a new doctrine out of the hat, like pulling a rabbit out of a hat, or pulling pulling a dove out of a mitre, as I like to say. That's exactly what Pope Francis does. They just wave the wand of development of doctrine, and suddenly, contraception is acceptable in some circumstance, or in vitro fertilization is acceptable in some circumstance. Homosexual unions are acceptable in some circumstances. We haven't quite gotten to the end of this process, but it is a process that is very visibly going on right now. Now, let me just say one last thing about the Council of Trent, the Second Council of Trent. I think it would also be fully in keeping with the teaching of Pastor Aeternus to say in the Council of Trent, the Second Council of Trent, that any time the Pope teaches not ex cathedra, not to define a matter of faith and morals, which is to say like 99.9999% of the time, that his decrees or his texts have to be approved by, let's say, a plenary session of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, or maybe even the College of Cardinals, or something like that. Now, I realize right now the situation in Rome is so bad that what the College of Cardinals approves may not be much better than what the Pope himself writes from his own head. But in theory, we would hope by the time the Second Council of Trent comes that there has been a rejuvenation of the Vatican and of the Curia and of the College of Cardinals, so that you have men like Bishop Schneider at that time is going to be Cardinal Schneider, that they will be the ones calling the shots. Now, somebody could object, that's an absurd idea. Do you realize how much that would slow things down? The Pope would hardly be able to publish anything. And you know what I would say?
Great.
Amen to that. Right? We have this flood, like Noah's flood of documents coming from the Vatican. This has been going on now for 50 years and more.
And I think, the height of that sort of pontifical garrulousness was found in the person of John Paul II, who was also the one who gave us, I think, the biggest papal personality cult with his globe-trotting and so forth. I'm not saying he wasn't well-meaning, but the person, I grew up during that era. This is my era. I grew up, and I was all part of that personality cult of John Paul II. And it was really now that I look back at it, it's sort of like you looking back at yourself when you were a freshman at TAC in the first chapter of your book, which I thought was very humble and very funny that you reproduced that letter in that journal entry back when you were a pious papalist.
We grew up at the same time, and John Paul II was like a rock star. If you look at the way he was treated at the World Youth Days, and of course there was the famous infamous World Youth Day in Denver. That caused Mother Angelica to sort of like finally just say I'm going for blood. She had her Popeye moment. That's all I can stand. I can't stand no more. Yes, exactly. The Stations of the Cross. Now, the cult of personality. Exactly. So really, the irony here. There are so many ironies on every level. The popes now, for decades, they talk so much that it's, apart from a small number of Catholics who are glued to their words because they give them a sort of guru status, even though we know that, for example, what a pope says in an interview is nothing but his personal opinion. It should have really no significance for any of us. But apart from a small number of people who are glued to the guru aspect, the Pope speaks so much that it's become very easy for us to ignore him, and his words, in other words, don't have the kind of moral authority, the kind of weightiness that the words of somebody will have when he chooses his words carefully and speaks only on special occasions.
Okay, I just found the page. You say on page 109, the Pope is at once far greater than ever and far more negligible. And when I underline that and wrote an exclamation point aside of it, because of this multiplicity of words, his words aren't few and grave and important. They're now so so garrulous, so it's so verbose that you expect him to comment on anything and everything, and he obliges, unfortunately.
Yeah, and he becomes a talking head. I mean, that is to say, like we like to make fun sometimes of YouTube personalities who, I mean, I don't have anybody particular in mind, but there's this whole phenomenon now of people who are just constantly putting out show after show after show, talking about this, that, and the other thing, whether they have any competence or not, to talk about these issues. And the Pope has become, similar. The Pope should not give interviews where they just talk spontaneously and then it's broadcast all over the world. I mean, it's really, when you stop and think about it, if you can just pull back and think about it as a sociological phenomenon and a cultural phenomenon, it is absolutely bizarre what's going on with the papacy in modern times.
Now, on the going back to something a little bit more on the dogmatic level, you quote, or at least paraphrase, Cardinal Ratzinger. I don't know what to call. I mean, Benedict XVI. I'm not sure what he was when he said this. The Pope is the servant of tradition, not its master. So again, this fits in with the papal oath, the concept of the papal oath. The Pope is the servant of tradition, not its master, because he receives it and he has to guard it and safeguard it and keep it and help it to be diffused. But occasionally when errors come up, he has to define, and he might even have to do that as the head of the College of Bishops in an ecumenical council. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's right. Father Hunnick, Father John Hunnick of the Anglican Ordinariate, I like to quote him regularly. I think all of us enjoy reading his blog. But he one of his favorite quotations is when John Henry Newman says or describes the Holy See, the See of Rome, as being a remora, a barrier against change, against innovation, right? Mm-hmm. And that historically Rome was the stick in the mud. They were the ones who changed the slowest. They adopted customs after everybody else did, like praying the creed in the mass, right? It came to Rome at the end, in the end, after it was being done elsewhere, and then finally Rome, said, okay, I guess we'll do a creed during the mass, So I mean, the conservatism was so famous that it was almost a reproach that some people could bring against Rome, that it wasn't an engine of doctrinal development. Well, it's not supposed to be. I mean, the engines of doctrinal development really are theologians, I would say, at least if they're doing their job well and responsibly. It's going to be a mind like St. Thomas Aquinas's, who I mean, Thomas isn't trying to be innovative, but in fact, he ends up being innovative just because he's so good at what he's doing, and his mind is so powerful, and his gifts of grace so considerable, that he ends up, pioneering new paths in theology. And this is that's really where you have, this fruitful unearthing of ideas and a dialectic and conflict, and the Franciscans against the Dominicans and the Jesuits and all these sorts of things, right? But the Pope is there kind of like an umpire in a game, right? Like, okay, as long as people are playing by the rules, as long as nobody is being violent, or obscene or whatever, just let them play, let it play out, and step up and blow the whistle when it's necessary.
Yes, yes, as he did have to do during the De Auxiliis controversy between the Dominicans and the Jesuits.
Right.
You have a chapter early on in the book called Portrait of a Perfect Pontiff. Aside from being highly alliterative, it's also very instructive because it's showing you the book is not like ripping apart the Pope and saying, look, we need to really limit the papacy. That's not your point. Your point is to say we need to have a tradition, a papacy that's in line with the tradition of the Church. And here, and in that particular chapter, which I really liked, you go through the martyrology and you pick out all these Pope saints and you categorize them according to these different categories that they fit into as, missionary popes who encourage the missions, like Pope St. Gregory, who is responsible for the evangelism of England, but you talked about the martyr popes and these different popes, and then you give this sort of complexus of the different virtues that a pope would have to have, and I thought it was a good read. I'm mentioning it so that the audience gets a sense of what else is in the book by way of content. You also do this wonderful thing where you run the numbers, and I'd never seen this before. Where you talk about, okay, we have these here's a litany of loser popes. These popes who, like Honorius and Liberius and who had doctrinal issues, and Pope. What was the one who was dragged off to Constantinople and pulled down an altar when they were saying mass and they tried to haul him away?
Vigilius.
Vigilius, thank you. Yeah. So you give these sort of doctrinally compromised popes, but then you give popes who were moral reprobates, like say John the 12th. But then you say, but look, we have these 90 canonized popes. And we have blesseds among the popes, and this amounts to, I think it was like a third of the popes who were extremely virtuous, and then the ones that we sort of, I'm calling them losers, the ones who sort of were spots on the Holy See, they amount to 3-point-something%. So. The book isn't an attack against the papacy, as again these liberals are calling you that. They're saying you're attacking the papacy. I had a Twitter spat with somebody about this.
Well, so this point about the numbers. I mean, somebody misinterpreted me about this as well, because they said, "Oh, look at Kwasniewski. He's making a probabilistic argument. Like you should follow the Pope because 97% of the popes have been good." No, that's not the point of the argument. What I say is that. There's this famous statement. I read it first in Garrigou-Lagrange, but I don't think he's the one who originated it. But it goes something like this: there is enough light available in order to have faith, but there's enough darkness so that faith is not necessitated.
Mm-hmm,
right?
Mm-hmm.
There's enough light to believe. There's enough darkness to disbelieve. And so the act of faith is a free act. It's not something compelled by the evidence the way that, say, a conclusion in mathematics is compelled. Once we see the premises, we see that the conclusion must follow. And so similarly, I was making the argument that if you look at the history of the papacy, what you can see is that God has protected it from, God has given us a 2,000-year sacred monarchy that has no parallel in the history of the church, in the history of the world, in the history of any other religion, not even anything close to it. And, if God had preserved if he had made 100% of popes saints, then we would probably be able to say with some high degree of probability there will never be a pope who isn't a saint. If most of the popes, or even a very large number of them, had been renegades, morally or doctrinally, it would be hard for us, humanly speaking, to put our faith in the papacy as an institution. But if the vast majority of popes have been either decent or exemplary, and a small number of them have been rotten or losers, to use your term, then what that shows us is we can trust the institution because it's in God's hands and he's going to guide it. But we still need to be vigilant. We still need to stand on our own 2 feet. We still need to know our faith, just in case we happen to be the ones living at the time of a Pope Honorius, or a Pope Vigilius, or a Pope Liberius, or for that matter, a Pope Paul VI, right? We need to be aware of what the faith is, because clearly there were lay people in the 4th century, who were supporting Athanasius, right? They weren't supporting the Arians or the semi-Arians or the compromisers.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's really the point I was trying to make with those numerical comparisons.
Yeah, and the tomorrow's a feast of St. Peter of Nisibis. He's mentioned in the Martyrology, and he was one of the ones at Nicaea. And so here you have this example of a great a bishop who was part of the defense of the church against Arianism, and after Nicaea, you get the semi-Arian crisis, and you have lay people and monks and so forth having to hide out St. Athanasius because the semi-Arians are in the ascendancy. But all of these historical, these loser popes, as I call them, these difficult popes, the fact that the historians had to wrestle with this, and they did at Vatican I, shows you that we have the necessary tools to understand that these are a problem, and that people weren't saying everything the Pope says and does is great, so don't worry about it.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, and and another objection has been brought against me, which is, you're attacking hyperpapalism, but if you ever got a pope who was to your liking, you'd be the first one cheering him on, as you'd be more ultramontanist than the rest, right? And somehow people think that's an objection, right? But it's not. It's not at all. I mean, as you see from that portrait of a perfect pontiff, the Pope has massive authority for the good. Authority is always given for the good. It's not given for abuse. It's not given for violence. It's not given for cruelty. It's not given for the kind of things that Pope Francis is doing in Traditionis Custodes, right? Yeah. But papal authority is given for confirming the brethren in the faith, for upholding and defending tradition, for promoting the beauty and solemnity and dignity of the liturgy, for upholding marriage and family, and the divine law on sexuality. That's what papal authority is for. So if a pope wants to come along, like Pope Athanasius Schneider, okay, sorry, I keep using his example, but if Pope Athanasius wants to come along and define, 100 dogmas of the faith against the modernists and the progressivists, I will cheer him on every step of the way. That's not hyperpapalism. That's just the Pope doing his job.
Well, Dr. Kwasniewski, I'm afraid we have run out of time. So thank you for a good interview. I really appreciate it.
Oh, you're welcome. Thanks for having me on again.
You've been listening to Reconquest on the Crusade Premium Channel. God bless and may He keep you.